Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the BRLSI. And another dreary evening out, so hopefully you're finding refuge here, not just from the weather, but also experiencing 19th century science in conflict with Orthodoxy, today's topic. My name is Andreas Wasmuth. I'm a director here at the BRLSI and honored to be a co-convener with our speaker today, Don, in philosophy. So I'm looking forward to lots of questions and answers after the talk. And before I get going and introducing our illustrious speaker to tonight's main event, it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Don Cameron once again to give a talk. Don has been a stalwart of the institution for the last at least 20 years. And in those 20 years doing philosophy, he must have introduced well over 100 lectures, probably getting close to 200 lectures in that tenure. And he must have given at least a dozen, probably closer to 2 dozen lectures himself. So he has a huge amount of experience in philosophy and life in general. So it is with a great, great pleasure that I will welcome Don to the stage for tonight's talk. Don, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. It's a rather difficult introduction to live up to. But this evening I would like to reflect on some of the changes which have taken place in the generally accepted worldview. In particular, I would like to think about science and religion over the last 2 centuries. And I will talk chiefly about Britain from the 19th century, although many countries have followed a similar trajectory, and the ideas and the trends have come from many lands. Whether you have religious faith or a non-believer, it's a fascinating story of how individuals and entire societies develop their beliefs. It gives a deeper understanding of the ideas we hold in our own time, and it's worthwhile to reflect on where these things have come from. First of all, let's look at the ideas of science. The idea is relatively new. Although there were beginnings in classical Greece, it is almost entirely a phenomenon of the last 500 years. There have been many attempts to define the scientific method, but essentially it's a determination to carefully avoid mistaken belief. The great physicist and communicator Richard Feynman, he once said, the first principle is you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. The quote became famous because it need not only apply to science, but self-deception is one of the weaknesses that we all have. We all want to believe what gives us pleasure. We can think of the features of the scientific method. There are many versions and differences between different fields of study. But the first thing is that anyone can question anything, not the attitude of who do you think you are to question the great Aristotle. We should observe and record methodically, avoiding bias. We make and record methodical observations, and we form a hypothesis which makes falsifiable predictions. For example, I might claim that there's an invisible elephant in my garden. No one can touch him because he moves away when you try to do that. He has no footprints because he hovers in the air. And no one can prove that my claim is wrong. But because there is nothing that could falsify it, it's not worth considering. Stress testing of ideas is important to perform experiments and eliminating mistaken beliefs, which leads to more accurate explanations. Science based on observation must always be considered provisional, but continued challenging and testing gets ever closer to the truth. There are 2 types of reasoning, deductive and inductive. Deductive is more certain, not absolutely certain, because we have to assume that evolution has installed the right rules of logic in our brains. But reasoning of the sort, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, they seem pretty sound. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, is a question of saying something has happened before, so it will probably happen again, and it is much less secure. But we trust our life to inductive reasoning. Aeronautical engineers use it all the time, and we risk it. And in fact, we couldn't live without it. Induction can be greatly improved by experiment. Now, historians, of course, wouldn't call themselves scientists, but nevertheless, they have, in recent times, adopted a more strict discipline of trying to avoid bias and trying to avoid self-deception. It is possible to make, thank you, it's possible to make testable predictions about the past. Darwin did this when he made the prediction that the cradle of mankind would be Africa, and it was only long after his lifetime that he was proved correct. As science progressed, it certainly posed some problems from the worldview of the 1800s in Britain. Science has found that Earth is 4.5 billion years old, not 6,000 years. The Earth is spherical and not flat. The Earth is not fixed in space, as the Bible says. It rotates and it orbits the sun. The sky is not a solid firmament with lights in it. And humans are a product of evolution, not created in a single day. And consciousness is the action of about 86 billion nerve cells in our brains, and not the action of an incorporeal soul or spirit. And of course, scholarship of the origin of the Bible has revealed some surprises. None of these, of course, denied the core of religious belief. That could still be true, but so many things being wrong undermines confidence. And the history is fascinating. By the 4th century CE, the Church had achieved dominance in the Roman Empire and continued to deepen and reinforce its power in Europe, even as the empire declined. Christians destroyed much of the classical world. It was considered as evil paganism. Temples were smashed and classical statues broken up. All learning other than religious was stamped out. This is illustrated very well by a wonderful book by Catherine Nixie called The Darkening Age. And she describes, for example, how Christian mobs attacked the statue of Athena in Palmyra and smashed it to pieces. In the 20th century, it was carefully put back together again by conservators and exhibited in a museum. But alas, in 2015, Islamic mobs destroyed it once again, probably beyond repair this time. The Christian Church had achieved dominance of all thought in the time up to 1500, but had incorporated some pagan science into its theology. But it has suppressed the very essence of science, which is the freedom to question and investigate. For over 1,000 years, the only educated and literate people were priests or monks. It was only in the 1500s and 1600s that inquiry about non-religious subjects began very slowly to reassert itself. Interest in the pre-Christian writings began again too, although much had been lost. Some was recovered only from Arabic translations. The major factor in this Renaissance was the invention of printing in the 1400s. The story of Galileo became a classic in the conflict between religion and science, but it has perhaps been a little overplayed. Galileo was a university professor and made some interesting discoveries, but he became convinced by the theory of Copernicus that the Earth actually moves, it rotates on its axis, and it goes around the sun once a year. The problem was that this was in conflict with Holy Scripture, which stated that the Earth was fixed in space and did not move. Galileo was well connected. The Pope was a personal friend, and he was given permission to discuss the heliocentric theory, but not to claim that it was true. He wrote his dialogue of the two chief world systems. It was crafted as a debate between sorry, I got that wrong there. Crafted as a debate between the three characters: Simplicio believing in a fixed Earth, Salvati for the Copernican system, and Sagredo the neutral observer. Of course, Salvati won the argument, leaving no doubt of the correct answer. Even worse, Galileo put in Simplicio's mouth the arguments that the Pope had given him. So it was not surprising that the Inquisition summoned him and forced him to recant and confined him to a fairly comfortable house arrest. His fate was certainly more comfortable than that of Giordano Bruno, who was burned to death in 1600. He had supported the Copernican theory and conjectured that the stars were distant suns and might even have their own planets. Galileo died in 1642, the year that Newton was born. Newton, though at all times highly religious, would go on with others to put the heliocentric theory beyond all doubt. Here we have Archbishop Usher. This was far away in England and was during the time of the Civil War. But during these turbulent times, he spent almost his entire life trying to calculate the age of the Earth. He did a lot of work and actually established that the birth of Jesus was probably in 4 BC, in which he was probably correct. But it was a simple task compared to the intricacies of the Old Testament. In some parts, the patriarchs begat each other, and it was possible to construct a timeline. But in many areas, the Bible was silent. So he used histories of Babylon, Rome, Persia to get the thing organized. And he even had to consider the difference between the Julian and the Gregorian calendar. After a lifetime of these studies, he arrived at an answer. The world had begun in 4004 BC, on the 22nd of October, sometime in the late afternoon. The entire Christian world accepted it, but it really is unfair of us today to laugh at Archbishop Usher, because he did a tremendous job with the information that was regarded as absolutely certain at his time. When he died in 1656, he was interred in Westminster Abbey. But science continued to develop and doubt continued to be cast. In the 18th century, James Hutton, a Scottish geologist, concluded that the world must be much older. He did this after studying, for example, strata in rocks. The present-day processes of deposition were capable of having their effect, but only over long periods of time. About the age of the Earth, he famously said, "We find no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end." This was contradiction of Holy Scripture. In fact, it was two contradictions. But in the 19th century, a lot more was to come. Mary Anning came from a poor family living in Lyme Regis. She had learned the trade of finding fossils and selling them. And they were exposed in the nearby crumbling cliffs. In 1811, with her brother, she discovered the skeleton of an ichthyosaur. And this, of course, was of great interest and was purchased eagerly by gentlemen scientists. Many of these gentlemen scientists were in fact Anglican clergymen, but the writings began to cause controversy. The finding of these monsters were puzzling. Noah had ensured the survival of all land animals. No one seems to have wondered how he arranged for South American species or Australian kangaroos, and it was blasphemous to suggest extinction. An even greater problem was the depth at which specimens were being found. Genesis tells us that the land had been created before the animals. So how could these remains have come to be 100 feet below the surface? In the early 1800s, almost everybody, including the educated elite, fully believed that every word in the Bible was literally true. Scientists, many of whom were ordained clergy, believed that their investigations were discovering and confirming God's creation. In lectures and academic writing, scripture would be mentioned, and even when discrepancies began to appear, it was usual to go to pains to show there was no conflict. The trouble was there were troublemakers. These could be suppressed and punished. Richard Carlyle in 1819 was fined £1,500, perhaps 200,000 in today's money, and he was jailed for 6 years. His crime was printing Paine's Age of Reason. Anyone professing atheism would be dismissed from their jobs and discriminated against in every way, in addition to being prosecuted. William Buckland was one of the pioneers of geology and paleontology. He was himself an ordained Anglican. He gave the inaugural lecture at Oxford, marking the beginning of the study of geology. He had to diffuse negative opinions, and he said that geology would unite the highest attainments of abstract science with the much more important purposes of religious truth. Geology was not to be dangerous to religion, but would serve to confirm it. I have in fact looked at the entire text of this address, and it's one long promise that religion has nothing to fear from science. Sadly, that didn't work out. It was said that God had written 2 books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. It was unthinkable that they could contradict each other. It's difficult for us today to understand the intensity of religious belief in the early 1800s. But the blows kept coming. In the 1830s, Charles Lyell wrote The Principles of Geology, in which he showed that much of geology that we observe is due to effects still working today. They had made great effects, but only after millions of years. And the dinosaur remains kept coming too. This evidence could not be brushed away. The reconstruction of exhibited skeletons took hold of the public imagination. They were much more interesting than other dull scientific results. In 1844, a book appeared called The Vestiges of Natural History of Creation. It was anonymously written, and there was great controversy at the time to find who had written it, and he was eventually found out. It was Robert Chambers from Edinburgh. This was enough to scupper his chance of standing for Lord Provost of the city. Lord Provost, of course, is the same as Lord Mayor. And during this time, Darwin had been developing his ideas in secret, only disclosed to a few of his scientific friends. He feared the social suicide it would be to publish, yet he knew his theory was right. The stress may have been the cause of his chronic ill health. He published in 1859, but only then because Alfred Russel Wallace had discovered exactly the same principle. To try to deflect criticism, he kept humanity out of the origin, saying only light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. In 1871, he became a little more immune to controversy and went the full way with the descent of man. By the second half of the 19th century, society had become a little more used to living with conflicting evidence. But Darwin did receive some heavy criticism. He largely retired from open debate, but was ably represented by others, including Huxley, who became known as Darwin's bulldog. Huxley could be openly agnostic by this time. He invented the word. He is seen here with Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, or Soapy Sam as he became known. His debate with him in Oxford is still famous to this day. Many people were in simple denial about evolution, but a completely rational objection was raised by Lord Kelvin at Glasgow University. Kelvin was the foremost physicist of his day, and among much else, the discoverer of absolute temperature, that there was an absolute zero, and you've all heard of degrees Kelvin, I'm sure. He also did a great deal of work on the second law of thermodynamics. He had observed from mines and from boreholes that the deeper you go into the surface of the earth, the greater the temperature becomes. And he measured these numbers and also measured the conductivity of the rocks, of typical rocks. And he calculated from this that the earth had been cooling throughout its history from a previous very hot state. And he worked out that it must have been only 20 million years ago that the earth was red hot and impossible to sustain life. This troubled Darwin greatly, although all the other evidence seemed to verify what he was putting forward. But it was only discovered after the death of both men that it's radioactive activity in the center of the earth that is creating the heat that is causing the temperature gradient, not a process of cooling from an initial very hot state. It's one of the most unusual stories in the history of science. During the 167 years which have passed since the origin, biology has made dramatic advances. Mendel carried out experiments on inheritance of plants, but was unknown to Darwin, although it was being done at the same time. Today, the understanding of DNA and the genomes of organisms have repeatedly confirmed the process of natural selection. Amazingly, there are still creationists who cling to the hope that it can be disproved. Meanwhile, the higher criticism of the Bible had been taking place in Germany. Scholars had begun to study the earliest documents in their original Hebrew and Greek. They showed that it has many contradictions, copying errors, and mistranslations. And this work began to penetrate the English-speaking world. And here we see a typical nerve cell. Neuroscience has improved greatly since Darwin's time. Much remained to be learned, but it seems clear that it seems clear at any rate to me and to many others that our mental activity is due to electrochemical activity of 86 billion nerve cells processing information. We have a talk by a neuroscientist in this series later in the year, and of course we've had earlier talks and one still to come where people are claiming that consciousness arises by panpsychism, by some other method. We will all be able to form our judgments on that. So by mid-century, the religious majority had become more used to hearing counter-evidence. But nevertheless, in 1883, G.W. Foote, the founder of the Freethinker, was given a year in prison for blasphemy. But by 1899, the rationalist press was formed, and it could promote disbelief without legal opposition, although many books would not sell its titles. It's interesting that by the late 1800s, vocal non-believers were persecuted much less, but their influence remained completely negligible. Most people continued to believe, and conflicting science seemed to be no problem. As evidence began to accumulate, there were also various arguments by apologists. For example, some days of creations were millions of years long, so Genesis could still be true. Since 1950, the Roman Catholic Church has accepted evolution, but it's difficult to see how the creation of Adam in a day could be reconciled with billions of years of evolution from lower animals. It seems that Adam and Eve were the first to have souls. It must mean that they had soulless parents and lived in a community of people with no souls. We might wonder whether any of these people without souls are alive today, possibly employed as parking wardens. If there are any parking wardens here this evening, please accept my apologies for the joke. I remember one incident from my own school days. We had a radio broadcast about dinosaurs millions of years ago. The teacher had some prepared illustrations. There were no TV in those days. And at the end she said, "Perhaps you've been wondering about the conflict with the biblical story of creation." And I must confess that although I had been interested by the lesson, it had not crossed my mind. But she said it's okay really, because for God a million years can be just a day. There has always been a difference between the elites of science and the church compared to the general population. Most people give more thought to day-to-day matters in their lives than our subject this evening, although they are peripherally aware of it. A popular belief in the literal truth of the Bible persisted longer. In my own post-war childhood, we were taught to believe absolutely, and to be an atheist or heathen was to be considered quite unacceptable. But over the last 50 years, there's been a steady decline in religious observance, while a substantial minority hold to it. In my view, we must accept everyone's choice with empathy and tolerance. We can only cover a fraction of the history in the time available this evening, but perhaps the take-home message is that attitudes to conflict between science and religion have changed greatly, while at the same time it might be remarkable that they have not changed more. We have been speaking mainly about the history of the 1800s. The religious orthodoxies slowly became resigned to doubts raised by science and became accustomed to ignoring them. Attitudes to the conflicts of ideas in the 1900s are harder to understand. The first half of the century, the Victorian groups advocating atheism continued, and they were viewed by most as a bunch of eccentrics. They had no impact on general belief. In the second half of the 1900s, humanists and others make no attempt to advocate disbelief, yet religion seems to have declined. The full reasons, I think, are not yet well understood. For those who would like to go into more detail of the fascinating history of the science and religion, I would heartily recommend Michael Taylor's book, Impossible Monsters. It covers much more than I have been able to describe this evening. And an excellent compendium of some of the primary sources for the subject has been produced by the Open University. It is Science and Religious Belief, 1600 to 1900, published in 1903. I don't know if it's still easily available, but it's a very, very good source of many of the early writings on this subject. So I've touched on some of the history and science and religious belief. It's a fascinating subject and well worth a study by believers and non-believers alike. It gives an understanding of many of our social attitudes today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Don, and for the excellent exposition of science, not just in the 19th century, all the way back to the 14th, 15th century, and obviously the increasing conflict with orthodoxy. I'm glad you mentioned Darwin and on the origin of species. We've got a copy downstairs as you walk out of the building. Have a look at the first edition of that book. We've also got plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, paleontology at the museum. So again, something to look at. But now we're getting to the Q&A session. I'm going to move a bit further away from Don to get rid of it. Is that better? We now get to the Q&A session. Obviously, fascinating subject. Science and religion. Maybe we're comparing fact with faith. Maybe they're not quite the same thing. But it'll be interesting to see what everybody in the room thinks. We'll start in the room, and then I go online and see what people have got to see there. So, who would like to ask the first question? Nobody? This gentleman at the back.
Thanks very much, Don. I wonder if I could put a couple of short questions to you. Sorry, can you hear me all right? Yep. Yeah. You talk about science in conflict with the religious authorities, but in fact probably what broke that down was the Reformation, and it was that called into the question religious authority, and so perhaps opened up the way for others to question. Also, it seems that you've discussed religion in terms of those who believed in the exact word of the Bible. In fact, if they hadn't been so stuck on the exact word of the Bible and actually had sort of fixed onto that a certain amount of Aristotelian philosophy, which they also saw being destroyed, if they hadn't been so fixed on that, in fact, there wouldn't really have been a conflict. So, can I ask your opinion on those two matters?
I must apologize, but I'm having difficulty hearing you. You did mention the Reformation, which, of course, like the growth of science, was very much an offspring of the invention of printing. But the second half of your question, I didn't quite get it.
I think the second question was about religion taking the Bible too literally, and if religion didn't take the Bible so literally, but actually made more allowances for some of the Aristotelian and even Platonic philosophy, that conflict wouldn't have been as big.
Yes, I think that's so, but it's a matter of history rather than what ought to have been done. That literal interpretations were virtually universal in 1800 and before that, but only gradually did the more allegorical approach become prevalent.
I hope this microphone is better. It sounds a bit better already.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. Two questions as well. One is kind of, do you not see that there's actually some overlap? But some people argue that scientists wouldn't believe in stable laws of nature, whether that's the second law or third thermodynamics or gravity, without a Christian perspective, without the idea that there was a lawgiver, and that maybe other cultures didn't have that. So therefore, there's a continuity between science and religion rather than a break. And the second one is just I mean, it's sort of you can't cover everything, but I'm thinking of some of the sort of monstrous perversions and errors of science which hasn't been mentioned. For example, say eugenics or scientific racism or creating a weapon large enough to destroy all of humanity. So I guess it's seen as in your talk, science is seen as the knight in shining armor, and it's not always the case.
Well, I certainly agree that I think the idea of science is a knight in shining armor, but some of the things that people have done with it is less satisfactory. But the question of the laws of nature is a more fundamental one. I think I've heard people say that if there are laws of nature, there must be a lawgiver who set down these laws. But this is an absolute confusion, because a natural law and a law which is made by Parliament are two entirely different things, the same word used for something different. The natural law is simply something which has been discovered by inductive reasoning, and it's always provisional, of course, because the sun may not rise tomorrow morning. But it's not a law in the sense of a statute that someone's debated and produced in Parliament. Utterly different things, and the analogy mustn't be taken too far.
Okay, although I would argue, Don, that whilst science may be a knight in shining armour, the shining armour and the knight changes. Science isn't something that is static. Science is something that evolves and gets replaced. Scientific worldviews get replaced by better worldviews. And that's what gives the scientific method its strength.
This is the problem with inductive reasoning. Newton's laws of motion were very, very accurate, but as Einstein showed, there are circumstances where they're not quite accurate enough. But nevertheless, all the engineers today use Newtonian mechanics because in the range of dimensions and time that they're dealing with, that's perfectly good enough.
Okay, any more questions in the room? Gentleman at the back.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering whether you could give me your insight into why, in the most scientifically advanced country perhaps in the world at the moment, in America, there are people who believe, and are very happy to believe, that the world started 4,000 years ago and that Darwin is wrong. And why do you think humans, who you think, they say they'd be rational, and they'll give you their own reasons why that is, why do you think that they haven't come on board with science in its current form and with its current deductions? Do you see what I'm saying?
I heard the first part of your question, which is why does America have a great deal of fundamentalists? Well, everyone builds a worldview in their minds as they lead their lives. And of course, if we have built up a worldview, then if someone comes along and presents some evidence to say, throw it all out and start from the beginning, most people will be quite reluctant to discard this investment. But there are slow changes. Even in America there are slow changes, but America does seem anomalous compared with Western Europe.
What is interesting, just to paraphrase your second bit of the question, is why do people seem to not have faith in science, but have faith in religion?
Yes, well, that is quite a phenomenon that we observe. The people who are against vaccines and so on, and the various forms of misinformation that circulate. I don't know if I'm an expert to tell you why that happens, but I do observe that there is a form of logic which is extremely popular, which is that if I don't like it, it can't possibly be true.
There's an online question. Could one blame the state of education in the 19th century and even into the start of the 20th century that it was too concentrated on teaching the classics and repetition?
It's certainly true that the classics were, and not much science was taught in the 19th century, in the 1800s. That's possibly because not much science was available. Buckland, who I spoke about, he was just beginning to introduce geology in Oxford, which hadn't been done before. But of course, learning the classics is not entirely a waste of time, although it might appear so, because it does train the mind to learn other things and to exercise reasoning.
Don't you feel that we're losing something by concentrating too much on STEM subjects now?
Well, of course, the reason for concentrating on STEM is partly intellectual, partly because it's extremely satisfying and worthwhile to have a scientific understanding of the world. But of course, the other reason is that it's economically more important than the humanities.
Okay, we've got another questions coming in thick and fast down here.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Until recently, most of our great scientists were religious. Newton was a man of great faith. So was my own scientific hero, Michael Faraday. And then people like Kelvin and James Clerk Maxwell. I mean, there has been a lot of great scientists who were very religious individuals. A notable exception in recent days, or recent times, of course, was Francis Crick, and also Jim Watson, who died last year, aged, I think, 97. But there has been a great correlation between deep religious faith and expertise in science. Now, can you comment upon that at all?
Well, I think in these days past, everyone was very religious, and any non-religious person was quite an exception. But I've read somewhere that nowadays, if you look at the top scientists, the Fellows of the Royal Society, for example, less than 10% are religious. But again, it's not zero. So everyone has to form their own opinion.
As I said earlier, maybe they're answering different questions for scientists. Maybe scientists want to answer the fact and want to have their faiths confirmed. Maybe that's why scientists can be religious, because they think there is something beyond facts in the world. But over to the next question.
Thank you. I'd just like to your comment on the fact that, or the question about people having faith in science. I would have thought the last thing any true scientist wanted was for people to have faith in science. They want them to accept the evidence that's presented. That would seem to me to be more important.
Did you hear that, Don?
Some of it.
Yeah, so basically the comment is scientists don't really want to have faith, they want to have facts. They want to be certain about what they're studying, rather than having faith in what they're studying.
Well, of course, there is a train of postmodernist thought which says that science is just another myth system like all the others, and that people are having faith in it rather than evidence. But, well, what is science? As I said earlier, science is just being as careful as possible to believe the truth. The scientific attitude is very open to discarding ideas as soon as they've been called into question. So I don't think it really is valid to speak about having faith in science, because after all, the scientist, the fundamental principle is that the scientist is ready to abandon his hypothesis if the evidence is against it.
Oh, well, if that's true, Don, I can't wait for the standard model of physics to be put into the dustbin of history and see what comes next. We'll see. I think sometimes science hangs on to its paradigms, maybe a little bit too long.
Of course, if you're a working scientist, it's much more wonderful to have a famous and significant discovery than to actually just prove that you're wrong. Yeah. Although you should try both equally, but there's a very big temptation to stick with your hypothesis even when the evidence has undermined it.
Hello, question at the back. I'm here with my son, and like most children in school, he studies science and they study religion, but the conversation we're having now is mainly a philosophical one, and most children don't study philosophy, even at secondary school. Do you have anything to say about the value of philosophy for young people today?
Well, it's difficult to know what we mean by philosophy. I know some school courses are described as religion and philosophy, but certainly it would be good to teach young people critical thinking and how to examine evidence and really think for themselves.
Yeah, and I think just on that, we actually run a course of sixth form philosophy here at the BRLSI for exactly that reason, to enable people to have critical reasoning skills and a much broader outlook on life. And we're doing that for the sixth formers because they're just about to embark on their own life's journey, because they're going to university. They're not going to be away from their families, away from the school environment. And I think it's really, really important that people can evaluate and really critique themselves in terms of what their beliefs really are. So I think it's definitely something, I think there's something definitely worthwhile. It's not about learning philosophy, it's about discussing things, right? And finding things out with other people around what makes life worthwhile. Somebody else in the room? Otherwise I'll go back. Oh.
I was thinking about the Copernican revolution and all the trouble that it caused Galileo and Bruno. Did this not originate more from Aristotle and the fact that I think Thomas Aquinas established the Aristotelian view of the universe as Christian orthodoxy rather than from the Bible?
And I can't quite quote chapter and verse, but I think the Bible does. I think in Isaiah somewhere it says the earth is fixed. And in various points there is a cosmological model. The one which I must admit as a child I first thought was the way it worked. A kind of three-story model with heaven above the earth and hell down below. But that is implied in a number of places in the Old Testament.
Yes, but Christians must have abandoned that a long time back.
Yes, I think...
because they knew the world was round and they could sail around it.
Yes, the Greeks discovered the world was round even at the time when it was being written that it was flat. But certainly certain things didn't seem too much of a problem. Although there was literal belief in the 1800s in Britain, the heliocentric model had already been fully adopted and everybody knew the world was round. But nobody bothered too much about that. But of course, when Darwin came along, it was a much more difficult thing to ignore.
We have a question directly to you, Don, here online by Sarah. If you had to pick one of the scientists that you have mentioned this evening in terms of their importance or interest to yourself, who would you choose?
Well, it's, I think it would obviously be Darwin, so probably it's more interesting to try and think of the next best. But I think Buckland was certainly interesting, although he was a man who was grappling with conflicting ideas.
Okay. Any more questions in the room? There's no more. Oh, there's a gentleman here again.
Sorry to ask a second question, but I noted at the beginning of your talk, or very nice lecture, that you said science is a relatively new thing, and faith, I would suggest, is not, if you look at Stonehenge. I'm a medical doctor, I believe in science, but I see a lot of people who try to interpret the world through faith, because science doesn't deliver certainty about the human condition. Could you just tell me whether you think science in its present form will be around in 200 years?
Science is... Sorry, the last sentence?
It's really about that thing between faith, not organised religion, but between faith, which sometimes manifests as organised religion, and science. And you've observed that the scientific method is relatively new, everything changes. Do you think in 200 years' time that we will still have science in the same place, prominent in society, or not?
Well, it's very difficult to forecast, especially about the future, as somebody said. But it would be very rash indeed to say that there will be no more progress and that we've got all the answers. After all, Lord Kelvin said something like that towards the end of the 1800s. He said that he was a wonderful man and he did a lot of great work, but he said quite a few things that turned out to be wrong. And one of them was that he said that science has more or less solved all the problems now, and it's just a question of tidying up the edges. He also said that there will never be a successful flying machine. So he made a few mistakes, but then all scientists do.
Okay, there will be science, and there will be other things apart from science in our world. Any final question before we draw things to a conclusion? No? Well, in which case, can you please join me in thanking Don for a very interesting evening?